Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Washington Outsider. Our video today is Irina Zuckerman, your host, and with us, joining us is a special guest, Dr. Moshe Terdeman. The discussion will focus on Iran's renewed aggression in Africa. An interesting topic, multifaceted to be sure, but not news, despite the recent reporting. Dr. Moshe Terdeman is the founder and director of the Research on Islam and Muslims in Africa. He's a research fellow at Esri Center for Gulf Countries Research at the University of Haifa and the co-founder and director of the Institute for Environmental Security and Wellbeing Studies. Dr. Terdeman, I'm turning it over to you to let us know a little bit about yourself, your work, what exactly you're doing, and then we'll get right into it.
Well, my expertise is really for many years on Islam in Africa, or the Horn of Africa, Red Sea studies, and environmental issues in the Arab and Muslim world, including in Iran. And I see the big picture from which to take off all the things that are connected to Israel in the region.
How did you manage to navigate between your interest in environmental issues and this issue of religious and religious studies, and of course, and the study of Muslims, the study of the Horn of Africa? Those are quite distinct areas.
Yes, the issue is that really environmental issues are very now basic, and even terrorist organizations are taking advantage of environment in order to advance their cause. And also Iran, all the protests we see in southwest Iran are also connected to environmental issues. So all those things together makes it look like, and also that environment is now a very basic issue in international relations, and in order to understand the Middle East and Africa better, and also Islamic activity, you have to understand environmental issues.
Indeed, it's becoming quite a topic unto itself, and it's used by all sides in different ways. And of course, understanding the local lay of the land is just as important, which sometimes seems to be missing the mark for counterterrorism efforts of various Western countries in Africa. I may be off here, but watching some of the activity in West Africa, in the Sahel specifically, I sometimes wonder whether they have taken these issues into consideration at all.
Not so much. We see it. I mean, on the ground, we see that terror is still continuing. We see that the Europeans are leaving, really, are decreasing their forces. And we see that the environment is ruling on everything. I mean, climate change, its impacts.
And even the environment itself, when you are not in control of the situation, it makes it much harder for you to understand where the enemy is hiding, how they're using the local conditions, and how to essentially go past the issue of airstrikes and to have an effective ground game. That seems to be missing from the current asymmetrical warfare strategy by most countries facing non-state actors. I am wondering whether that will also become an issue with Iranian and Hezbollah and other militias, Iran-backed militias operating in Africa today, but we'll get to that point. Actually, before we get into the use of the environment, how they're able to recruit followers and how they're able to make effective use of the local conditions, I wanted to talk a little bit about the background for Iran's presence in various African countries, because it's not really a new thing. It goes back at least to the 80s, with a much more active effort in the 90s. We've seen in the past Hezbollah attacks. We've seen their diamond-based fundraising efforts in various places. We've seen previous attacks on Israeli personnel, on business people, on Saudis as well in the 90s. But we seem to have forgotten about this past history. Can you remind us, can you tell us more, what is Iran doing in Africa, why it got there, why it never went away, and how did we manage to forget about it until the last few years?
Yes, first of all, Iran didn't really, Africa didn't mean a lot to Iran until really the Islamic Revolution in 1979. From then on, there were countries like Kenya who closed Iranian embassies in their states because they were afraid of the extremism that this kind of an Iranian influence may impact in their countries. So this was the start, 1979, where African countries were afraid of the export of the Islamic Revolution of Iran into their countries. Then some of the countries renewed the relations with Iran. And now Iran is really in the continent, mainly in East Africa, South Africa, and West Africa. In East Africa, there are some Shiite minorities. And therefore, Iran is built on them in order to expand its influence. In South Africa, this is a country that is based on Iranian oil. So therefore, it is important for South Africa to have relations with Iran. And by the way, Iran also launched this year a direct maritime shipping line with South Africa and with Latin America, meaning that its aim is really to increase its influence in both continents. But today we are talking about Africa. And in West Africa, there are also a lot of Lebanese migrants and also other Shiites. And therefore, Iran is also based there, especially in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Ghana, from where we saw the last attacks or trials of attempts to attack Israelis that were published recently. And in the Horn of Africa, it's really connected very much to Ethiopia and to Sudan, which cut its relations with Iran in 2016, after Saudi did this as well. And then now it's renewing, it seems like, its relations with Iran.
Now, that's an interesting comment, because you previously mentioned that Sudan, well, first of all, before we even get to the 2016 events, the attack on the Saudi embassy, which led to a number of Arab and Muslim states cutting ties with Iran, the Bashir regime, which is now gone, had a reputation for hosting Al-Qaeda and Iranian elements. Osama bin Laden infamously found a place of refuge, and some of the roots of the 9/11 attacks stem to the facilitation of these relations in Sudan. And yet, following those early meetings, there's not much discussion about what happened afterwards. Until 2016, what was the nature of Sudan's relationship with Iran? How comfortable were they there?
First of all, Sudan had very good relations with Iran, as it had very good relations with its rival Saudi Arabia and others, meaning that Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, this regime is not like Omar al-Bashir's regime, but Omar al-Bashir was a great maneuver. And he knew how to maneuver between all the regional powers and also the superpowers, and to use everyone against the other and together with the others. So Omar al-Bashir was an expert on that. As part of that, he had good relations with Iran. And as part of those relations, he allowed Iran to smuggle arms to Hamas through its territory. And according to foreign publications, Israel bombed a few times Sudan on those issues and intercepted those smuggling attempts. But so Sudan had good relations with Iran, really. Also Ethiopia, although Ethiopia has also very good relations with Israel.
So it's interesting because right now we are talking about two extremely unstable places. Sudan, after the Bashir was deposed, had a transitional government that was supposed to transition from the mostly military to increasingly civilian rule. We saw protests, we saw a failed coup of sorts, which which Burhan had blamed on Islamists, who had indeed attempted to interfere in Sudan in the past year. There's been some Muslim Brotherhood-backed attacks, but he blamed this conveniently. He blamed this particular coup on the Islamists. No one ever really saw evidence either way of who was specifically behind the failed coup. Then he instituted his own purge of Hamak and certain political elements who were then, he released a number of Islamists, Bashir era Islamists, who were then rearrested. On the Hamak contingent was released under pressure from a number of countries. And now you're saying that this new regime seems to be normalizing its ties with Iran again. What exactly is going on with this new Sudanese government? Why, after receiving major financial support from Saudi Arabia and UAE, are they looking to Iran again?
First of all, they did receive all the support from the UAE. They also received promises from the US government for aid that never came. Mm-hmm. And now they are also saying that they are going, therefore, to let, and because of the US government's treatment of them, to let Russia have its base in Port Sudan. And if we look at all those variables, we can see why it may let Iran, I'm not sure it's normalizing, it's the right word, but letting Iran be in its territory, that's maybe more the right term, why it will let them do so, especially if there is a financial benefit included in it. Who knows? I mean, I don't know, but I don't think it's just merely like that we saw an attempt of just in the UAE embassy in Khartoum. In February. So, you know, it's something that it's going on for a while because the Sudanese government, it seems, doesn't see any other hope. I mean, so they let others in.
So in Sudan in particular, there's a couple of interesting things that seem to have fallen off the radar of the international media and discussion. First was was supposed to join the Abraham Accords, and there was an Israeli delegation traveling to Sudan shortly after the new purge coup, whatever you want to call this recent chain of events, to discuss what's going to happen with these changes. But there doesn't seem to be much push to strengthen the Sudan's relations with Israel, and it's unclear what benefit, other than maybe promises of humanitarian aid from Israel, Sudan is deriving from this relationship. Now, with Morocco, the restoration with the relations was clearly linked to U.S. recognition of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara. With Bahrain, UAE, we also have seen clear advantages, clear trilateral efforts under the Trump administration and so forth. What exactly was Sudan supposed to get out of this diplomatic arrangement?
Seems like, first of all, it was ousted of the list of terrorist of the terror countries, and so this is the first thing, and then the sanctions were got off. But right now, we see that there are governments like Germany and others who are just preventing any aid to Sudan because of this coup, meaning that we are transitioning back, it seems, to the beginning. And therefore, the current Sudanese regime, after the coup, or whatever it is, I don't know how to call it even, because I'm not sure it's a coup at all, and so I don't know how to call it. But let's say it's a coup. So the current regime doesn't really know what to do, and it seems like it has to deal with the West because it needs aid. It lets some other reactionist countries in, like Iran, because maybe they get from them some aid. They are having relations with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the rest. And it also fights with Ethiopia over the Fashaga region. So it's very complicated, and Buran himself, if I may say, is much less smart than Omar al-Bashir. And he doesn't know how to maneuver with all the forces, and therefore he is in a very big problem.
It's interesting because, there's another factor here that an elephant in the room that I am just going to, it may seem like I'm sidetracking momentarily, but it will make sense. Some have said that Egypt is at the very least tolerant of the military elements attempt to seize and consolidate power in Sudan because they believe these military elements to be more stable in the long run than the completely civilian-led government for what it's worth. I don't know whether that's true or not, but Egypt has also been accused by some scholars in the Israeli press and Israeli scholarly element of making deals with Iran, particularly during a big, fairly recent conference in Iraq, which also included Jordan and a number of others. Now, I don't know whether that's really true, whether that coordinated conference in Iraq, where from what I saw, some of the Iranians who were present there attempted to gain the sort of place they weren't really, no one really wanted them to have. Whether any of that really points to any sinister role of Egypt in all of this, or whether Iran is looking to influence Sudan's neighbors as well. What's your perspective on all of this? Because it seems to me that that countries that have a major stake in Sudan are also need to be cognizant of other external influences there, such as Iran. So what do you make of this?
Let me separate it to two issues. One is the chaos in the Horn of Africa, and the other is Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So now the Horn of Africa is very chaotic. The only stable country in the Horn of Africa is really Djibouti.
Mm-hmm.
All the rest are very unstable. And therefore, we see the Iranians taking advantage of this. And in Ethiopia, they are supplying drones to the regime. And there are, photos of it. And it's a well-known fact. In Sudan, and also in Ethiopia, there was this attempt to have an attack on the UAE embassy, together with the one in Khartoum. So Ethiopia tries really to destabilize the countries even more, it seems, or to destabilize the region even more by assisting the ruling regimes like Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia and Burhan in Sudan. As for Egypt, and by the way, we saw also yesterday or today a report on Iranian arms getting to Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this together is showing that Iran wants to have more than a foothold in the Horn of Africa. It's very important to her.
So, mm-hmm.
And Ebrahim Raisi also said, the Prime Minister of Iran, the President of Iran, said that Iran will prioritize developing and increasing relations with African countries. So he really operates this way. So this is Iran. Now Egypt is another issue because Egypt is really involved very much in the Renaissance Dam. And as part of this, it needs Sudan on its side.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it needs a stabilized Sudan. And it tries to have an impact on this in many ways. One of it, I believe, is really to see this government being stabilized.
Do you think that the civilian government is going to be less stable than the current one?
That's a hard question because I don't know what will happen in Sudan, and if really they can now resolve their issues. But it seems like Egypt wants Sudan to be stabilized, and it will do everything it can in order to secure it. Although it's not in our hands too. We saw already with Omar al-Bashir that it wasn't in its hands. So now they try to operate with the new regime with a success that we don't know what it is. Don't know what's the level of success of this.
We are seeing a pattern of Iran's activities with unstable African countries, which are increasingly, it's sort of impeding in entering territory that's actually very much sphere of influence for Turkey and Qatar. We've seen Iran entering some of its equipment and the arms into Libya, where Turkey and especially has been particularly present. We are seeing that in Somalia, where Turkey and Qatar have both had very significant political, economic, and other influence. We are seeing Ethiopia, which purchased new drones from Turkey fairly recently. You just mentioned Iranian drones being sold to the government as well. And where Turkey is looking to kind of establish spheres of political influence and territorial economic control. And there's a whole issue around oil, Iran seems to have expressed interest in recruitment in potentially military bases and also in search of uranium in some countries such as South Africa and surprisingly Algeria. What do you make of it? Do you foresee tensions between Turkey and Iran over this issue, or do you see them as having completely different spheres of impact and therefore unlikely to really clash? They've even come to some sort of a religious agreement on some issues despite being radically different in their governing Islamic doctrine.
No, I don't see that. What I see, the pattern of really Arab and Islamic countries' involvement in Africa throughout the years is that everyone is cooperating alongside the others. And we saw, for example, Saudi Arabia active alongside Iran, or Egypt and Libya alongside Iran, Libya of Gaddafi, and Egypt throughout the years. So I don't think that Turkey will clash with Iran. It will just being active alongside it. Also, the African countries want it this way. I mean, they want to get aid from everyone who can give it to them. So they don't mind having both Turkey and Iran being active. I mean, it's not 1979 when Kenya closed the Iranian embassy. Now the African countries don't do it anymore. And we see Sudan with letting Iranians or Iranian activists or supporters back into its territory in order to try to stage a terror attack against the UAE embassy. So we see also this. So Iran is basically active in places where there are Shiite minorities, or where it's important countries like Ethiopia, South Africa, and Algeria. It's also a very important country for Iran. And it tries to make headways in other places as well. With again, I'm not sure how much it succeeds, but in other places in Africa where it really doesn't have, especially those which have good relations with Israel throughout the years, it didn't use to, let's say, pronounce clear thoughts or declarations against Israel. They understand that they are active alongside Israel. Only in countries such as South Africa, who are vehemently against Israel, you can see that. But for example, in Nigeria, they will not say that.
Interestingly enough, Iran went after UAE's diplomatic targets, even as the trade between Dubai in particular and Iran continues to blossom. Why do you not see any, I mean, it's understandable why they see UAE as a competitor or a rival or an obstacle in Africa, but do not see it interesting that its actual attacks on the UAE targets had no diplomatic impact otherwise and no trade impact with UAE.
Right. It seems like the UAE understands that it needs to be very careful with Iran. We saw it already in Yemen, when the UAE stopped fighting there, supposedly. I mean, it's still there. That's why I say supposedly, but it announced it. And and we saw it also in other places, and it has really, the UAE is in a very, let's say, delicate position, because on the one hand, she has Saudi Arabia. She is between two giants, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Needs good connections with both. So that's her policy to survive.
But the Abraham Accords in particular were supposed to create a sort of anti-Iran alliance between Israel and some of the GCC states. And of course, there's been discussions of some joint operations and counterterrorism activity in the Gulf. Do you see that sort of cooperation also growing in Africa, or do you see UAE is such a small actor that really it can't make a difference, and this alliance is really not going to become anything significant until Saudi Arabia joins it, whenever that happens?
First of all, just yesterday started first of its kind exercise, naval exercise between the US Fifth Fleet and the UAE, Bahrain, and Israeli naval forces in the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just to answer your question in very, so yes, it makes a difference. It makes a lot of difference because the UAE is based in Socotra. It's based in the Bab el Mandeb, which separates the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And Israel supposedly can use those places in order to monitor Iranian shipping in the area. So yes, it does make a difference. However, as I said before, we need to understand that each country now from the GCC needs to looks at the US, looks what happened in Afghanistan, looks that sees that the US is really trying to get her forces out of the area, and they are worried. They want to have securities that the Iranians will not take advantage of it, and they will not be stuck with Iran. So they have to have their relations with Iran secured, each country in its own ways. And they also, some of them, need Israel in order, as part of this security against Iran. Meaning, as Israel will be the foot soldier in the future war with Iran, maybe. So
I'm not sure whether that's an honor or I mean, I understand why they would feel that, but it's a compliment to Israel for sure, but at the same time I'm not really sure what it says about the nature of the alliance if everyone is expecting Israel to do the dirty work.
Yes, and on the other hand, the business is even much more complicated, because now Saudi Arabia and the UAE and also Egypt are enhancing connections with Turkey. So so all this makes the situation very complicated, and it's really, it has in it a lot of advantages, but a lot of unknowns, let's say.
Getting back to what you said about the Red Sea activity and security for a moment, there's two kind of things I wanted to take a look at. The report you mentioned in detail showed the path of mostly Houthi weapons that are supplied by Iran of Iranian origin, entering Somalia through particular sea routes, and from there being disseminated to various cities and impacting local security situation. one question is, this raises the question about the relative effectiveness of the littoral alliance in that area that is headed by Saudi Arabia, but it also includes Egypt, also includes Ethiopia and others. What can you tell us about that group? How active are they, and how is it possible for them to work together at all, given the number of tensions between its various members?
Well, the Horn of Africa is really a very hard place, a very complicated place. I mean, in the last 2 years, meaning from about July 2018 until the beginning of, until now, there was a security agreement between Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, joint security agreement that now dissolved itself because of the Ethiopian civil war. And as of now, the region is really deteriorating back to the 90s. And therefore, Iran can really take advantage of this deterioration and put itself on the map in this region, back again. And that's what it does.
Another issue concerning that general vicinity, now actually getting back to Ethiopia for a second, there is a general sense from a number of analysts watching the area that the government may not hold out. Eritrea has apparently withdrawn most of its support. The Tigray rebel forces have been advancing quite actively. The general population felt deceived by the government and is not particularly supportive of the call to arms recently pronounced. The measures the government has been taking are increasingly authoritarian in both sides of the conflict, and other groups have been sanctioned by the US government, but to little obvious effect. What happens in the event that the government falls? Where do you see Israel recognizing the potential Tigray-led coalitional government, and what impact is it going to have on Israel's security role in that area?
First of all, Israel will be welcomed by any Ethiopian regime whatsoever, because Ethiopia has a very special relationship with Israel. And it's going to continue whatever government is there. So from this perspective, there is nothing to worry, I think. What government will be there? It's hard to say, because I think that at the end of the day, Abiy Ahmed will fall. It will take maybe some time, but he will fall, and maybe a lot of bloodshed on the way, but he will fall. And the issue is what kind of Ethiopia is being created, because this Ethiopia that Abiy Ahmed is part of in this ruling is based on ethnicity. Each ethnic group has its state, autonomous state. And then now, when all the civil war is really enhancing ethnic cleansing and ethnic rivalry, maybe Ethiopia will be built on another principle, which is not ethnicity. Before that, it was religion. Also, this is no more an issue in Ethiopia. So now we need to look what the future will have in its store. I mean, we don't know what they will do. But for sure, Abiy Ahmed will fall, despite the aid he's been given to by Iran and Turkey and Russia and China.
Do you believe these countries will continue to back whatever the new regime comes afterwards, just for the sake of having presence?
Let's take, for example, China. China doesn't take sides. It says it wants stability. It doesn't want to intervene. It doesn't want to intervene in internal situations in other countries because it doesn't want others to intervene in its issues. So this is a very long-standing principle of China. However, China needs Ethiopia as part of its strategy in the region. And Ethiopia is really one of the main powers in Africa, not only in the Horn of Africa, but in Africa at large. So Ethiopia is a very important country, and I'm sure that, again, whatever regime will be next, it will have good relations with everyone. The Ethiopians always knew how to make it happen, except in the time of Mengistu, who took the Russian side.
Do you see Iran and China's relationship, which is already showing some signs of growth, given the recent agreements? How do you see it evolving in Africa, or are they completely pursuing their own separate courses without any real coordination?
I think they are pushing their self-interests without collaboration. However, I'm sure that part of it collides with each other. I mean, collides positively with each other. And therefore, they are collaborating on some issues and they are also conflicting on other issues. For example, the Red Sea and the issue of security of shipping in the Red Sea. That's an issue in conflict, I believe, especially when the Iranians are supporting the Houthis, who are trying to damage the shipping in the area. So,
but by that token, the interesting thing about the report that you mentioned is that it noted the role of Chinese equipment in assault rifles, in the rifles that are making their way into Somalia from Yemen. And we've also known that some of the drones supplied to the Houthis by Iran with the Qatari financing, and at one point German engines were Chinese made. So at the very least, China, while it may not approve of the conflict and instability, had no qualms about selling these weapons or providing them as needed, despite taking measures to try to hide their role in all of this. So the question is, I mean, it seems to be that at the very least, China is not opposed to Iran's efforts in that general vicinity to the extent it claims to be, and may be playing a facilitating role.
No, I'm not sure it's opposed to Iran's activities, especially not in Yemen. I think that at the end of the day, what will happen in Yemen is that there will be two governments, one Houthi and one that is Saudi-backed, Yemenite government, which will follow the south-north line. And therefore, because this is something that will happen at the end of the day, everyone understands it, then China is not against. They also doesn't see the Houthi as a terrorist organization. They see it as part of the structure of Yemen nowadays. As for Somalia, China is very involved in Somalia. It has a lot of almost all the fishing contracts of the tuna in the Somalia waters are belonging to China. And this is one of the reasons that made the Somali fishermen go into piracy. Because of China's main involvement in in Somali waters.
We are seeing these renewed, or at least attacks that have started making the news again, even if they were ongoing the entire time, on Israeli targets in various places. In the past, Hezbollah was mostly considered responsible for some of them. Hezbollah has also renewed its activity separate and apart from Iran's state apparatus actions. But we are also seeing renewed some level of new types of attacks from the sea on the Israelis that we've seen in the article recently. What can you tell us about that?
First of all, that again, the countries that the article mentioned, I cannot say much about the attacks themselves or the attempts because there are no details so much about it. But I can say on the background that the states mentioned, Kenya, Senegal, Ghana, are states where there are Shiite minorities. So those things are, again, built on the Shiite minorities that are already there. And according to the article, they went to Lebanon and got some training from Al-Quds forces, from Hezbollah. It doesn't matter who, because those are, you can say, the same thing. Then came back. And again, also this is not surprising. In Kenya, there are two separate Shiite communities. One that is, let's say, more peaceful, very peaceful. That's the Aga Khan, the Ismailis, who are for peace and for development. And there is the Ifna Ashris, who are just like Shiites in Iran. And they are the ones who are really promoting Iran goals in the region. I mean, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in those countries. And those people are also going to Lebanon, also going to Iran in scholarships and to learn religious studies and to be more extremists. And then they export the Islamic Revolution of Iran back to the countries where they came from. So those kinds of people are the ones who tend to conduct these kinds of attacks, not Iranians themselves.
So in terms of these militias, we're seeing a couple of different things. First, US has been very reluctant to designate African Iranian militias. Unlike the Iraqi counterparts, many of whom have faced some level of designation, we are not seeing much actions on the front of these particular groups. And quite frankly, in terms of Western US think tank analysis, there's a lot of tracking of Shia militias in the Middle East, not quite nearly as much in Africa. And the other thing is recently Hezbollah's financial arm, so-called, because it's one entity, was designated by Saudi Arabia, which I would have thought would have happened a long time ago. But the European Union refused to designate all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. They continue making the distinction, the somewhat mythical distinction between the military and the political and so forth. What do you see changing do you see any of that changing in the future? And do Europeans are certainly aware of Hezbollah's activity in Africa and their and the financing of various schemes, drugs, various crime syndicates, attacks on Israelis, attacks on Emiratis and others. What do you think is preventing them from treating Hezbollah as a whole as a terrorist organization, despite these issues?
I don't know really what prevents them from doing so, but I can answer you concerning Africa. Concerning Africa, there is really an ignorance, I can say, of the West at large towards this continent, which is taken advantage by countries like China, Russia, and Arab and the Muslim countries in order to get into this gap. And still, we see that Africa wants the Chinese, some African countries want the Chinese out. And instead they want Western investments, but the West doesn't come. I mean, it doesn't understand that if they will not be there, China will be there. Russia will be there. And we see that Russia is entering Africa in force recently. So also, because of this ignorance, we see that there is not much dealing with, there is dealing with terrorism in Africa, but not with Shiite sort of radical Islamic activity in Africa. First of all, I'm not sure they understand there is such an activity, if we begin from the basics. And secondly, they see it as something local that will not hurt their interests. And therefore, they prefer to ignore it for those two reasons.
I find it hard to believe that they consider these issues of little local interest, given the amount of the number of refugees flowing from various African countries into Europe and from there everywhere, disseminating.
No, I meant Shiite activity.
Not
Sunni terrorist activity.
I see. Okay.
This they really are on, although they are not acting properly to deal with it, but still they understand that there is a threat there, but they don't understand what is the threat that can be caused by Shiite communities who are proliferating radical Islamism of their sorts.
And they have never considered the possibility of cooperation between Shia and so-called Sunni terrorist organizations. That's never happened before.
It seems like not. I mean, they did see it between Iran and Al Qaeda. After all, but
and this particular element, by the way, seems to be extremely underplayed and ignored, even because from what I've seen, there's been a major lawsuit, an investigation of Iran's harboring of Al Qaeda even before 9/11, and this lawsuit took place. There was a decision. There was some activity circa 2011, and there's been zero discussion about that since then, and there's been very little detail. Former Secretary Pompeo had revealed Iran's ongoing relationship with Al Qaeda leadership shortly before leaving office, but he had not really elaborated or produced significant evidence of that, and it didn't really cause much of a discussion in the media either. So right now, we see various terrorist organizations, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and so forth, taking advantage of the chaos in all over Africa, as well as the Iranian growing presence. And it's hard for me to imagine that there isn't some level of coordination between all of these groups, at least to avoid conflict, if not to actively cooperate against common enemies. So I find that significant. This blind spot on the part of the secure European or even American security rather perplexing in that regard?
Yes, I mean, first of all, the West didn't even think until recently, until they saw it happen in Africa, that ISIS and Al Qaeda can collaborate, and they do. They also don't understand, I think, the relationships between Sunnites and Shiites in Africa, and especially the Islamic movement of Nigeria as a movement, for example, that is against the Nigerian regime and is active in northern Nigeria. And it seems like they fail to see those kinds of things because, first of all, they don't pay attention. It's not in their interests, at least, it seems.
Until it's too late.
Yes, but I mean, I think they ignore basic facts. First of all, to map who are the Shiites in Africa, to map the lines of smuggling of Hezbollah and Iran and others in Africa.
Are there such?
I mean, not only terror, also crime, because crime is always mingling with terrorism.
Are there such databases available in English at the moment, or is that some projects that are yet to be funded or backed by anybody?
I don't know about this because, again, Africa is a continent that is ignored by many, and therefore there is not so much research about it. And as long as it doesn't hurt to someone, or it's not painful, or it's not damaging the interests of any country, then everything can go as is. It seems.
I wanted to turn to something that seems to be another major issue. I've touched on it briefly, but that's being almost deliberately suppressed, which is Iran's pursuit of naval bases in Africa. And it seems to be that almost every conflict that it instigates in the region is in some way related, at least in part, in one dimension, to its interest in getting close to these bases. And first of all, are you aware of any active negotiations for Iran to build bases at the moment in any of the countries, whether in South Africa or somewhere else? And to the extent that that it's looking to do so in the future, given the fact that some of its activities its maritime activities have been less than friendly to Israelis, but also in general have presented concern to observers. Particularly, we've seen that happen last year near Yemen, where we've seen Iran use Russian types of sophisticated jamming techniques to abduct and divert oil tankers. What do you think is the future of Iran's naval activity in near Africa?
We saw it already. It's the present, not the future. Meaning, Iran said that it will enter the Atlantic, and it did. Iran said that Iran is part of the multilateral force that is fighting piracy, and therefore it has ships. War ships in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea as part of this. And those ships are, it seems, are part of the smuggling to the Houthis of arms and other stuff. And the Houthis themselves are part of the Iranian naval policy. I mean, we can see that. It's not always the Houthis themselves who are doing all the damage. And it is sometimes instigated by Iran. And the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea are really a theater of war between Israel and Iran for the last 2 years, as we also heard this year after the story with the Iranian ship Saviz in the Red Sea.
And we've seen that some of those attacks turned deadly. They went beyond economic damage into lethal level of activity.
Right. And therefore, this war is going on. And therefore, in September, the commander of the Navy, the Israeli Navy, said that Israel is really increasing its naval activity in the Red Sea. So because of this Iranian threat.
What happened to the US-led Sentinel operation that was supposed to provide provide oil tankers with a military escort and prevent Iranian aggression and provocations?
Iran started, or I don't know if it still conducts or conducted in recent days, a huge military naval operation in the Red Sea. And because of that, there is disjoint Israeli, Bahraini, US, UAE naval operation of 5 days now conducted in the Red Sea. So we are in arm wrestling between both powers, the US and Iran, and also Israel and Iran, while the UAE and Bahrain are in the middle. So,
interestingly enough, in the past, as I mentioned, Hezbollah had attempted to abduct and also attempted to assassinate Israeli business people in Africa in the 90s, but they've also gone after Saudi diplomats and there as well. Do you see that happening again? Is that something going on now that we are not hearing about? Do you see Iran returning to that in the future, or do you see Iran seeing Saudi Arabia in a place where it can be controlled and managed without having to resort to these measures?
It's hard to say because now there are negotiations or talks conducted between Iran and Saudi Arabia, although there are reports that they got stuck, but still there are talks. So we don't know what will happen with these talks, and I think Iran will be very careful because of the talks, not to infuriate Saudi Arabia. Not to do things because right now it needs really international support. It doesn't want to, infuriate anyone. It doesn't need to, except Israel, of course. And,
well, it's interesting because militarily, Israel has been the most active, or at least the most capable of opposing Iran, and yet Iran seems to be the most very brazen in Israeli in attacking Israeli targets, despite knowing the consequences of doing so, despite knowing that Israelis have been inside Iran, have gone to the borders, have agents all over Iran, and have conducted operations against Iranian targets very successfully. Nevertheless, they seem to operate with impunity when it comes to these maritime operations and African activities. Why are they so confident, and why are these covert actions have not stopped them from more aggression?
Africa is really no man's land. And therefore, we talked before on the Western ignorance. We talked before also on the Russian and Chinese infiltration and presence, and also on Turkish, Saudi, Egyptian, and others.
Mm-hmm.
And Iran is just part of this. So, and Israel also is part of this. I mean, we have to say it. Egypt is also against Israeli expansion in Africa, expansion of influence in Africa. It's not only an ally of Israel, it's also a competitor, let's say, of Israel in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So it's no man's land. So Iran can conduct its operations as it is, unless there is an intelligence that really gets it before. And we saw that there is an intelligence, luckily. And Iran is really trying to, as I see it, create four spheres of operations in Africa. One is in the Horn of Africa to take advantage of the chaos and to get back there.
Mm-hmm.
The other is East Africa, especially Kenya and Tanzania, where there are Shiite minorities. The other one is South Africa, with which it has good relations. And the other is, the last is really West Africa, some countries in West Africa where there are Shiite communities, and in the Mediterranean, Algeria. And it tries really to create more connections with more countries. I think we will see that more and more. I think that we will see what happened with the visits of Iranian presidents like Khatami or Rafsanjani to Africa, with dozens or hundreds of businessmen. I think we will see it happen also here with Raisi. And I think, yes, Iran would like to increase its influence in Africa. He said it. I think we see it happening. And I see it. I think we see it happening also against Israel.
Would it be fair to say that Israel is at somewhat of a disadvantage in Africa, given that in terms of alliances, it can mostly rely just on maybe Morocco and some GCC assistance, whereas and some local other African countries, whereas Iran faces potential cooperation from China, Russia, and various other fairly dominant states in the area?
No, I won't say that. I would say that Israel is having basically good relations with African countries because of the aid it gives them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very famous for this aid that it gives African countries from the 60s back to the 1960s and even 50s. So, so Israel is still famous for that, and its aid is very appreciated. So I'm not sure it's going, but in some countries, yes, we see South Africa who is really against Israel, its regime, I mean, its government. And therefore, the Iranian influence may just increase the apprehension against Israel. And there are countries where it will not hurt Israel at all, like Ethiopia, like Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
So it all depends on the country, its relations with Israel, and what Iran can do in order to harm it. In many countries, it cannot do much.
In the absence of active US institutional presence on the ground, and I don't just mean military, I mean institutional presence on the ground, it's obvious that Iran and other actors are going to be heavily investing not only in militias, not only in coups and government issues, but also in creating ideological basis for recruitment through mosques, through schools, through quote unquote cultural centers, through embassies, and so forth. Can Israel and its allies really oppose to that sort of long-term ground information warfare, ideological ground game? Or is their action can be limited to humanitarian aid and kind of short-term kind of operations to counter Iran's most aggressive attacks?
No, Israel cannot do much about it because this is part, all what you mentioned, all those ways are part of what Arab and Muslim countries have done in Africa from the 70s, 1970s onwards, including Iran. They all set up embassies, cultural centers, mosques, and scholarships for people to come to them to study their religious whatever part, and then come back to Africa and spread it to their countries and spread it. And that was always what Muslim countries did, and that's what they will continue to do with Israel on the ground and without Israel on the ground. So this will not change. What Israel can do is just, enhance its collaboration with African countries in the fields of aid, agricultural support, environmental support, business, all those kinds of things.
Do you think, and this is my kind of last point, the US absence from Africa right now, do you think that's going, do you see that changing? And if so, what role could US under some other perhaps administration in the future play that could help counter and could help assist Israel's efforts in countering Iran's aggression?
What the US can do right now, what the US can do is, first of all, basic knowledge of what is going on in the ground in matters of Islamic activities, both Sunnites and Shiites. Radical Islamic activities. And to look at it and to see also, to look at the crime networks in the continent and to see how they can, let's say, lay sanctions on them. Try to prevent their operations. At the end of the day, it's also part of the migration to Europe, all those kinds of things. It's some of the causes. And if the West will not understand this, they also, it's not only climate change and its impacts. It's also things out on the ground that have been going on for years and no one paid attention to them.
It seems to me that one of the failures of French-led counterterrorism efforts in West Africa in the Sahel has been the failure to understand these local conditions, failure to engage in not just countering terrorist tactical operations, but in countering the spread of extremist ideas and corruption and every condition that enables these movements to gain popularity and recruit followers. So it seems to me that at the very least, this is then something that those who do choose to be active in the field should at least consider, because any sort of radicalism, whether by Iran or by anyone else, feeds on these conditions, and they do also have an active presence that is familiar with local situations and doesn't just focus with the kind of with the tunnel vision on just, you know, carrying out the tactical task and waiting for the next batch of terrorists to pop up. That seems to me another missing link here.
Yes, and if you mention the French have also, I mean, great relationships with all the dictators in those countries, and therefore, if and they don't, and they still, despite the fact that they rule there in the Sahel, they seem not to understand how to cope with the ethnic cleavages that created also those terrorist groups in these countries. So it seems like they don't understand still, after, despite the fact that they were there for more than 150 years or so, they don't still understand the population.
Well, that may be what happens when you come in as a colonialist and not as a partner or an investor or somebody who looks for a relationship rather than just temporary use of resources. You tend to only look at what you need and not at the whole picture. But that's been a very, very informative and interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights and the information, because a lot of these issues are coming to a head as we speak, and yet we see almost no real analysis about it where it matters. Appreciate this, and I hope to see you back soon, because none of this is going away, and it will only become more prominent. I see that it's Africa that's going to be the next theater of next refugee crisis, next terrorist and extremist caliphates of sorts, because the jihadists from the east and the west are consolidating and meeting together and integrating their operations and forming alliances. And we are going to see, I think, Africa become a very prominent place, but very soon. And the question is whether we'll be able to control it or not. And that, of course, depends on what you said, whether we'll understand it in time or not. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.